Continuing my series on World War II tanks that need adding to War Thunder, we now move on to Soviet tanks. And you would be forgiven for thinking there can't possibly be many more Soviet tanks to add. But as it turns out, there are a whole bunch of Soviet World War II tanks and variants of existing tanks that still need adding to War Thunder. From obscure prototypes to tanks that were built in large numbers, without even touching tank destroyers, armoured cars and anti-air vehicles, which I will be looking at in a future video. So starting off with the Soviet light tanks, we have the T-40, an amphibious tank which entered production in 1940 as a replacement for the T-37 and T-38 amphibious tanks, while also being one of, if not the first, Soviet tank to go into service with a torsion bar suspension system. So unlike the T-37 and T-38, which were armed with just light caliber machine guns, the T-40 has the 12.7mm DSHK mounted in a turret. Now, a machine gun armament might not sound very impressive, but it actually performs far better against armour than the 20mm gun of the T-60 light tank, being able to penetrate 24mm at 500 metres with armour-piercing incendiary cement core rounds, versus 15mm for the 20mm TNSH, making this a far better anti-tank weapon, even surpassing the M2 Browning, while using the APIC rounds. It also has a top speed of 28 miles per hour or 45 kilometers an hour, meaning it can flank tougher enemies to target their more exposed flanks, while its amphibious capabilities do afford it some extra options on certain maps. Unfortunately, its armour is rather lackluster, as despite being improved over the previous tanks, it still only maxes out at 13mm, and is thinner in other areas, and this makes it vulnerable to virtually any anti-tank weapon, while its two-man crew makes it pretty easy to take out via crew losses. Overall, I could see this being folded with the T-60 at 1.0, giving Soviet players a better choice in regards to effective light tanks, and allowing this lesser-known tank to shine in War Thunder. In real life, only about 350 or so T-40s were built, with the German invasion commencing just after production had begun, though the T-40 chassis would be derived into the T-60, which was a far more successful Soviet tank being built in far larger numbers, around 6,000 in total. However, there would be another modification of the T-40 design, also confusingly known as the T-60, but this was later renamed to the T-30, and this was to have a maximum of 20mm of armour, a 20mm TNSH autocannon, and was to lose the amphibious capabilities, at least in some of the T-30s, as different factories used different hulls and components depending on what was available, plus there were some other minor changes. In theory, this variant could be added in-game, probably in a folder with the T-60, but I suspect it would be seen as just an inferior T-60, making it not a very fun tank to play, and likely not a priority to add. It should also be noted that some T-37 and T-38 amphibious tanks were also rearmed with 20mm autocannons, meaning they could be added if required, either as regular, premium or event tanks, giving us some additional light tanks for the early tiers. Fortunately for us, all of the other major Soviet light tanks are already in-game, but in the early days of Operation Barbarossa, as German forces rapidly advanced, orders went out for improvised tanks to be built out of agricultural vehicles, these being armed and armoured to become basic combat vehicles. This led to two basic improvised tanks being produced, the KH-TZ-16 in Kharkov, based on the STZ-3 tractor, while the NI tank in Odessa would be based on the STZ-5 tractor. Unfortunately, due to the improvised nature of these tanks, the armament and appearances can differ drastically from tank to tank, with some armed with machine guns, 37mm guns, 45mm guns, or other weapons entirely. When added in-game, I would try and standardise these just down to one model each, with the KH-TZ-16 being armed with a 45mm gun in a casemate, much like a tank destroyer, while the NI tank on the other hand did sometimes have turrets fitted, and it seems that a variety of different weapons might have been fitted, including 37mm guns like the M1930-1K anti-tank gun, which would be a good way of differentiating the two tanks. Armour is also different between these two tanks, with the KH-TZ-16 having 25mm of frontal armour and 10mm of side armour, while the NI seems to have about 10 to 20mm of armour, with these figures sometimes being different, or armour plate not actually being used, as it was all built up depending on what was actually available. As for the speed, it seems like the 16 could travel to at least 12 miles per hour or 19 kilometers an hour, which is on the slow side, especially once it gets off-road, while the NI tank supposedly could travel somewhere between 13 and 18 miles per hour or 21 and 29 kilometers an hour, which is a bit faster but wouldn't make it a speedy tank by any means. Lastly, the crew seems to have usually been around 2, which would make these tanks very vulnerable to crew losses, though some sources say 3 or even 4 could be carried when required, which could give us some additional options. In-game, I would suggest adding both of these tanks at 1.0, maybe one in the regular tech tree and one as an event tank, with these giving us some unique tanks that would play far differently to the other early Soviet tanks, with the KH-TZ-16 playing more like a tank destroyer, while the NI might play like a regular tank if using a turret-based armament. But both of these would be fairly slow and vulnerable, though this is a common theme in the lower tiers, and so while not the best tanks, it would be nice to see these unusual designs having a place in War Thunder. In real life, just under 100 KH-TZ-16s would be made, both in Kharkov but also Stalingrad, while the NI tank had somewhere between 50 and 75 produced. The KH-TZ-16 would be used to defend Kharkov, but they were ultimately unable to stop the German and Romanian advance, while the NI tank was used to defend Odessa, and seems to have had a bit of success against poorly equipped Romanian infantry, though again they were ultimately unable to stop the Axis advance, and of course it wouldn't be long before the factories to produce T-34 and KV-1 tanks were established in the Far East, which would end the need for such improvised tanks in the future. Of course, as well as new light tanks, there could be modifications to existing light tanks, for example the BT-7E, which is similar to the T-26E in that a BT-7 or BT-7M has been fitted with additional armour plates, though this doesn't seem to have been a widespread upgrade. This would bring the whole armour up to 45 to 50mm and the turret to 45mm, which is a pretty massive upgrade in protection. Of course, all of this armour would affect the mobility due to the increased weight, but to the extent this will happen depends on whether it's the BT-7 or BT-7M that receives the armour. Though with both of these tanks having either a 400 or 500 horsepower engine respectively, and already being fast tanks, I can't imagine they will be affected so much that it makes a massive difference in game, and lastly the crew and armament remain the same. As for where the BT-7E would go in game, I would suggest broadly at the same place as its already in-game counterparts, or maybe 0.3 higher depending on the armour's effectiveness. And I could see these tanks being a bit of a shock for some players that were expecting to get an easy kill with lower performing weapons, but most tanks should still be able to deal with them, and the reduced speed does make them a little bit less useful for flanking, but it would be nice for this lesser known BT-7 variant to be shown in game, if only for the unique look. So having looked at the Soviet light tanks, it's time to move on to Soviet medium tanks, and we will actually start off with some variants of the T-28, as there are a few upgunned experimental models that I didn't cover in the episode on Soviet interwar tanks, with the first of these being a T-28 armed with the 76.2mm F-32 gun, the same as used on the KV-1E, and it has a much better performance, being capable of penetrating 77mm at 500 metres with its top-tier APHE-BC shell, compared to 60mm for the length 10 gun of the regular T-28. To balance this, due to the gun's larger size, the time to reload could be increased, representing less room in the turret. As far as I can tell, the rest of the stats should remain broadly the same, though perhaps mobility would be slightly affected, and I think this could potentially work at 2.7, as we now have a T-28 with a much better gun than the regular variant, while not being overpowered. And at this battle rating, it would slightly bridge the gap between the T-28E at 2.3 and the KV-1 at 3.7, helping to avoid the massive jump in battle rating between these two tanks, and giving us a cool new variant of the T-28. In real life, it seems that this test wasn't a massive success, as no more T-28s were converted, but there was another conversion to give the T-28 the massive 85mm F-30 gun as used in-game on the KV-220, which has a massively increased penetration of 124mm at 500 metres, making this tank suited even to taking out tanks from 5.0 or possibly higher. though I can only imagine that the turret traverse and reload rate will be much slower than the regular T28, as I can't imagine there being much room in the turret due to the larger gun, while the longer barrel also makes the tank stand out more to enemies. I could see the mobility being affected by this new weapon, but the rest of the stats should remain broadly the same, and I think in game this could work at 4.7 to 5.0, probably as an event tank, and operating in the tank destroyer role, as we now have a T28 whose armour will be easy prey to tanks at this battle rating, but armed with a massive cannon that can one-shot many tanks, while also not being particularly fast, and I could see this being a bit of a meme tank if added in game. In real life, the 85mm gun was only fitted to the T28 for testing purposes, so this remained a one-off prototype. But these up-armed T28s are still interesting nonetheless. So having looked at the T28, we now of course come to the T34, with its development being covered in my last episode looking at Soviet interwar tanks. So starting off we have the initial versions of the T34 with the 76mm length 11 or F34 gun. And these are usually known nowadays as the T34-76, but this was actually a German designation and wasn't used by the Soviets, with them instead naming the tanks Model 1940, 1941, 1942 and 1943. And to be fair, Gaijin have done a very good job of adding these variants to War Thunder, with the models 1940, 1941 and 1942 being in the Soviet tech tree, while the model 1943 is currently in the Chinese tech tree, making the T34-76 extremely well represented in game, though the model 1943 could also be added in a variant with a cupola present. Of course, the Soviets were broadly happy with many of the T34's design features, such as its large caliber gun, effective sloped armour and mobility, but it was also recognised that many features could be improved or were negatively affecting the tank. For example, the turret only housed 2 crew members, meaning the commander had to man the gun, taken away from his duties as a commander. This and other problems were to be fixed in the T34M, which was to have a 3-man turret, as well as torsion bar suspension system, an increase in each side's road wheels from 5 to 6, an increase from 45 to 60mm for the frontal armour, and a new commander's cupola, with an order being made on the 10th of May 1941 for prototypes to be ready by the 10th of August 1941, and for production to commence in January 1942, giving this design a very bright future. However, on the 22nd of June 1941, a wrench was suddenly thrown into these plans by Operation Barbarossa, with the Soviet tank forces suffering catastrophic losses, with 20,500 tanks out of 23,000 being lost, while the factories that produced these tanks were rapidly evacuated eastwards, towards the Ural Mountains and Siberia, severely impacting production of light tanks. Understandably, there was no time to waste on prototypes for a slightly better T-34, with all efforts being focused on throwing out as many tanks of existing designs in as little time as possible, so no prototypes of the T-34M were ever made, though some minor components would be used on future T-34 designs, while the new turret for the model 1943 was derived from that of the T-34M. However, while the focus was primarily on producing existing tanks as quickly as possible, the Germans were quickly improving their own tanks, giving their existing Panzer IIIs and IVs thicker armour and longer barrelled 50mm and 75mm guns, meaning the T-34-76 would lose some of its effectiveness in battle. Thus, in the summer of 1942, orders were given to start development on a new universal tank, which resulted in the development of the T-43 as well as the KV-13, which we'll look at later. However, despite sharing 70% of its components with the T-34 model 1943, development of the T-43 was slow, and a prototype was not ready until March 1943, almost a year later. Like with the T-34M, the T-43 fixed many of the issues with the T-34, introducing a new 3-man turret, allowing for an extra crew member to be carried, and allowing for better delegation of duties within the turret. The armament, however, remained the 76mm F-34 gun from the regular T-34, but due to the roomier turret, the rate of fire increased from 10 rounds per minute to 13 rounds per minute. So even if the gun is not as powerful as those on tanks it will face, its faster reload rate may still allow it to win out, while a coaxial machine gun is also carried. Another improvement that was previously used on the T-34M is the use of a torsion bar suspension system, increasing accuracy when firing on the move, as well as the general smoothness of the ride of the tank, while its top speed is 31 miles per hour or 50 kilometers an hour, so similar to that of the T-34. The armour was also improved, maxing out at 90mm for the turret front and 75mm for the hull front, greatly improving the protection of this tank, while the total crew count is now 4, as while the turret now has an extra crew member, the bow machine gun position has now been deleted, so there's no gain in crew members. In War Thunder, I could see this being added at 4.3 to 4.7, as the T-43 is better protected than the T-34, has a faster firing rate due to the 3-man turret, and should be better at shooting on the move, helping to bridge the gap between the T-34-76 and the T-34-85, and I think this would be a very cool tank to have in game. In real life, by the time the first prototype was finished, there had been some developments, with the Soviets capturing 2 Tiger tanks with thicker armour that the 76mm gun couldn't penetrate from the front, and it was also armed with 88mm guns that the T-43's armour couldn't protect against, while encounters with the new Panther tanks during the Battle of Kursk showed a similar story. A solution would be needed to deal with these tanks, and it was quickly decided that the best way to do this was to improve the armament instead of the armour, allowing Soviet tankers to be able to penetrate the armour of these new German tanks, and not just at point-blank range. Work quickly started on fitting larger 3-man turrets to the regular T-34, allowing them to be armed with 85mm guns. This upgrade was great for the Red Army, allowing the T-34 to deal with these newer German tanks, but also showed that an entirely new tank like the T-43 just wasn't really needed, at least not yet, and in any case the T-43 was still only armed with the 76mm gun, and while it might have been possible to rearm it, rearming the T-34 was a much better solution, as it meant far less disruption to production, as opposed to switching to an entirely new tank, which of course would have severely hindered production. Thus the T-43 would be cancelled, and the T-34 would soldier on for the rest of the war, with the improvements to the armament seeming to be a better choice than focusing on extra protection like the T-43 had. So you might expect me to move straight onto the T-34-85, but as it turns out, fitting a new larger turret to the T-34 would take time, and while it wouldn't disrupt production massively, there would still be some disruption. So the Soviets carried out some tests on whether it was possible to fit the S-53 85mm gun into a model 1943 turret. As it turns out, it was technically possible to do this, but in practice the gun was far too large for the turret, significantly impacting the reload rate of the gun, which was hardly an ideal solution. The rest of the stats should be broadly the same, though maybe mobility will be slightly affected, and I could see this being added as an event tank at 4.3 to 4.7, giving us a very unique variant of the early T-34 that is much more heavily armed, with this being offset by the far longer reload rate, which could be doubled to account for the smaller turret, making using this in battle a bit of a gamble on whether the extra firepower will offset the slower firing nature of the gun. In real life, testing quickly showed that yes, a new turret would absolutely be needed, which resulted in the T-34-85 being developed, and like the T-34-76, this had many different variants. So before we look at those variants, we need to work out what the variants are already in game, as unlike the T-34-76's, the baseline T-34-85 in the Soviet tech tree doesn't actually have a model designation, making identification a bit harder. Until recently, the T-34-85 model had what looks like a summer 1944 turret, with a bulge on the left side of the turret for the electrical traverse system being present. Well, sort of, as it was sort of modelled to be there, but it didn't actually bulge out. But either way, it seems like this T-34-85 was intended to be a later war model. However, in the Leviathan's update, the T-34-85 was remodelled, so it now looks like a spring 1944 flattened style turret, with the rectangular bulge now completely removed, meaning that the electrical traverse system would also need removing, making this an early T-34-85, though this doesn't actually appear to be the case in game, as the electrical traverse system does still appear to be present as of the time of writing. Therefore, to fix the current T-34-85s, I would suggest keeping the starting D5T variant as it is, changing the existing T-34-85 to a model 1944, which would entail removing the electrical traverse thus reducing the turret traverse speed, and I would folder it with the D5T. That would then allow us to add the Model 1945, which actually started production in 1944, as a new variant, with this having the electrical traverse system, as well as a different style roof, and a single hatch cupola, much like the cupola on the Chinese T-34 Guy. So some of the modelling is already done for this tank. The Model 1945 would also have other advantages besides the electrical traverse, as it now carries the TDP smoke concealment system, which consists of two MDSH smoke canisters mounted at the rear of the tank, which is again already represented on the T-34-100, and would allow for the Model 1945 to get away from tougher engagements, making this a more survivable tank. Lastly, there would also be the Model 1946, which was the last of the major World War II T-34 models to go into production, and this would also have a new roof, the TDP smoke concealment system, and a new V2-34M engine. Now, some sources state that this engine had an extra 20 horsepower, bringing the total to 520, which is unlikely to affect the top speed much, but does give a slightly better power to weight ratio, making this tank a bit more manoeuvrable on the battlefield. Overall, I would folder most of these tanks, with the Model 1944 being folded with the D5T at 5.7, and the Model 1945 and 1946 being folded together in the current T-34-85's place at battle rating 5.7. Now, it might seem like these variants don't really add much to the game, but it would be nice to have T-34-85s with smoke concealment, something that is usually missing on Soviet tanks, while also showcasing the many variants of the late war T-34s that the Red Army was using during the war, and it would be good to see these added to the game in a more recognisable fashion. It should also be noted that Gaijin have said the T-34-85 will be moved to Tier 3 in the future, which along with the remodelling suggests that maybe Gaijin have at least looked at these models for adding to the game, so maybe that's something to bear in mind for the future. In addition to these main variants, there were also tests done on a small number of T-34-85s that were fitted with the STP-S53 Terran one-plane gun stabiliser, giving these tanks the ability to shoot more accurately on the move, at least at slower speeds. I was going to suggest adding these as a modification to existing T-34-85s, but Gaijin have already confirmed that a separate tank with these features will be introduced in a future update at Tier 4, so we will presumably get this tank in the not-so-distant future. In real life, the various T-34-85 models would serve from 1944 until the end of the war, taking part in the final battles on the Eastern Front all the way up to the Battle of Berlin, but were also present during the Soviet invasion of Manchuria in August 1945, where the Soviets completely destroyed the Kwantung Army and quickly liberated Manchuria before the ultimate Japanese surrender. The T-34-85 would not be built in as many numbers as the T-34-76 during the war itself, primarily as it only started production in January 1944, but it would go on to be built in larger numbers overall, due to staying in production until 1950, in both the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia and Poland. And these tanks would also receive further upgrades during the Cold War, which we will look at in a Soviet Cold War tanks episode. So that more or less brings us to the end of the Soviet medium tanks, as the T-44 that was supposed to replace the T-34 is already in game with most of its World War II variants, while its Cold War modifications will be covered in a later episode. And the T-54 also has its immediate post-war variants already in game, and of course its Cold War models will be covered alongside the other Cold War tanks. So this then brings us to the Soviet heavy tanks, and there are a surprising number of tanks and variants here to cover, starting with the KV-1 heavy tanks, which has most of its variants in game, but is still remarkably missing a few. For example, we have the Model 1940, which is very similar to the in-game Model 1939, with the 1940 having a new mantlet and 76mm F-32 gun, which has very similar stats to the Length 11 gun, though usually it has a reload rate of 8.2 versus 9.2 seconds for the Length 11, and could also be given the improved BR-350B APHE-BC shell, which penetrates 76mm of armour at 500 metres versus 69mm for the BR-350A, helping to differentiate the Model 1939 and 1940, In game, I think the Model 1940 could be folded with the KV-1 length 11 at around 4.0 with the improved shell, giving Soviet players a heavy tank for 4.0 and bridging the gap between the first KV-1 and the KV-1S. And while not a groundbreaking addition to the game, I think it would do decently well. After this, we have the KV-1E with its applique armour, and the Model 1941 also with extra armour and the improved ZIS-5 gun, and both of these variants are already in the Soviet tech tree, which brings us to the Model 1942, which is technically already in game in the German tech tree in a modified form, but also in the Swedish tech tree in a more or less unaltered form with the 76mm ZIS-5 gun. However, the main difference to other KV-1 tanks is the cast turret, which has a maximum armour thickness of 105mm, while some areas of the turret might in theory provide additional protection due to the sloped nature of the cast armour. A welded turret was also used, but the cast turret version would be easier to add and would give us a more distinctive looking KV-1 for the Soviet tech tree. Meanwhile, the hull armour should be the same as the KV-1 ZIS-5, maxing out at 100mm with applique armour, which greatly boosts protection but does make the tank fairly slow, with a top speed of 21.3 miles per hour, the same as the KV-1 ZIS-5. I would suggest adding this variant at 4.7 folded with the KV-1 ZIS-5, maybe allowing the KV-85 to be unfolded. And while this might seem to be very similar to the KV-1 ZIS-5, its turret should stand up to damage a little bit better, even with the negative multiplier for cast armour, and at the very least it would be nice to have a different looking KV-1 for the Soviet tech tree. So as we can see, there are a few major KV-1 variants that could still be added, but there are also some minor variants, such as the KV-1K or KV-10, which was a regular KV-1 Model 1941 fitted with 8 132mm rockets on the fenders, 4 in armoured launchers at the rear and 4 in about the middle. But unfortunately there is no horizontal or vertical traverse available, which necessitated turning the whole tank to aim them, and the lack of elevation would make hitting individual targets difficult. Now, one of my sources states that these are RS-82 rockets, but most seem to suggest they are M13 132mm rockets, as used on the BM13N in-game. And these rockets have a maximum penetration of 40mm with a 4.9kg explosive payload, making these decent rockets if you can hit the right spot, but as mentioned, I suspect aiming them would be rather difficult indeed. Mobility would also be affected, as the rockets and launching system add 1.5 tons to the tank's weight, and in theory if the rockets can be detonated by enemy fire, they could cause damage to your own tank, which might make them a double-edged sword. In game, I would suggest adding the KV-1K at battle rating 4.7, probably as a premium or event tank, as while the rockets would be an interesting addition to the KV-1, I doubt this variant will be much more effective than regular KV-1s, and like other rocket-armed tanks in game, they will likely be seen as a gimmick more than an effective weapon, but it would still be nice for this unusual KV-1 variant to be added in game. In real life, the KV-1K didn't go beyond 1 or 2 prototypes, mainly due to the difficulty in aiming the rockets, not to mention adding another 1.5 tons to an already overloaded tank was hardly an ideal choice, so no more tanks were converted. Now, the KV-1 was quite a useful heavy tank, but there were various prototypes and projects that were supposed to or could have potentially replaced it, with of course the in-game KV-1S being one of these, having less armour and thus less weight, in theory making it more reliable and giving it a faster top speed. However, there were many attempts to produce KV-1 variants that actually had more armour, which brings us to the T-150 or KV-150, which began development in August 1940. Bear in mind the KV-1 had barely started production by this point and was already a ridiculously well-armoured tank for the day. 2 teams would be formed to produce 2 tanks, with one designing what would become the KV-220, with 100mm all-round armour and an 85mm gun, and this is already in game at 6.0, while the other team designed the T-150, which was very similar to the KV-1 but now fitted with 90mm all-round armour, compared to the 75mm all-round armour for the KV-1 model 1939, making this a fair bit better protected. It was also given a new commander's cupola, which is also armoured to 90mm, but it could make the T-150 stand out more and provide an easier target to hit. especially for HE shells which could affect the roof, which is 30mm thick. Meanwhile, the armour was the 76.2mm F32 gun, giving the same performance as the 76mm length 11, but only has 3 degrees of depression, compared to 7 for the regular KV-1, which isn't great, while 3 DT machine guns were also carried, 1 at the rear of the turret, 1 in the bow and 1 in a coaxial position, much like regular KV-1s. Mobility, as to be expected, would be impacted by the extra weight, with the tank now weighing 15.1 tonnes, compared to the 44 tonnes of the original KV-1. However, this weight is somewhat offset by the use of a new V5 12-cylinder diesel engine, giving 700 horsepower compared to 600 for regular KV-1s, allowing for a top speed of 21.7 miles per hour or 35 kilometers an hour, only 1 mile per hour or 2 kilometers an hour slower than the initial KV-1 in game. And lastly, the crew remains at 5, like on the KV-1, with 3 in the turret and 2 in the hull. In War Thunder, I could see the T150 being added at 4.0, either as an event or regular tank. I could see this playing very similar to the KV-1E, which is another KV-1 tank with extra armour of around 100mm from applique armour. But unlike the T150, this doesn't cover the rear of the tank, meaning the T150 would have an ever so slight edge in protection, and the KV-1E's extra armour is a bit more obvious to players, as it is applique armour that has been bolted on top of the regular armour, while it's harder to tell that the T150 has extra armour at all, so you may be able to surprise some players who are expecting to deal with a lesser armoured KV-1. All this is while still having the same speed and even same gun as the KV-1E, and it would be nice for this relatively unknown heavy tank prototype to get some love in War Thunder. In real life, the T150 would be put through trials, but there were numerous issues, with the new engine breaking down after only travelling 199 kilometres, while issues with the turret cruise positions also cropped up. It was initially decided to move forward with the development of the T150, but on the 1st of March 1941, after the engine broke down again while being tested on another tank, the T150 project was cancelled, with priorities shifting to other designs, while it was found that applique armour plates could be fitted to regular KV-1s to more easily boost protection, ending the need for producing a wholly new tank design. However, surprisingly, the T150 story didn't end here, as it would be tested with more V5 engines, 5 in total, and managed to travel 2,237 kilometres by 19th of June. And due to an urgent need for tanks after Operation Barbarossa, it would end up serving as a combat tank, surviving until at least July 1943, which is a commendable performance considering how many other tanks from the start of the war that didn't survive, and showing that the design wasn't a complete failure. So the T150 didn't go into mass production, but its overall design was used as the basis for further developments, such as the Object 221 and Object 222, though they were to be armed with 85mm guns in new turrets, with the commander placed at the rear of the turret, with access to a cupola and periscope, improving the visibility, though drastically increasing the weight to over 50 tonnes, and ultimately these were never built beyond some hull components. However, the tank that was eventually chosen to go into service as the KV-3 would be the Object 223, but again this never entered production due to the German invasion, and work on new KV tanks would halt for the time being, as factories focused on just producing as many tanks of existing designs as possible. However, one project that did carry on was development of the KV-7, a 3-barreled tank that was armed with 2 45mm guns and 1 central 76mm F34 gun, and was actually added via an event last year. But there was an improved version of the KV-7, sometimes called the KV-7-2, which was instead fitted with 2 76mm CIS-5 guns. Now, I covered the whole of the KV-7 development process in a previous video, but basically after the first KV-7 was put through testing in its 3-barreled form, it would be cancelled by Stalin himself in January 1942, with the new tank instead being refitted with a U-14 gun system allowing for 2 76mm guns to be fitted, with trials beginning in May 1942. So straight away you can see that the double-barreled KV-7 is a bit more powerful, as while the 76mm CIS-5 has the same penetration as the F34 gun of the original KV-7, it now has 2 of them, with the extra gun being more useful than the 45mm guns of the original that can often struggle against more modern tanks, Other than the armament, the rest of the tank's stats should be the same, with a top speed of 21 miles per hour or 34 kilometers an hour, a maximum armor thickness of 100mm, and a crew of 6. I think the KV-7 U-14 could be added at battle rating 4.7 to 5.0, as while the main armament has the same penetration as the KV-7 U-13, we now have 2 of them, allowing for one gun to be fired at a time, given an almost constant stream of effective fire, or both could be fired to deliver the maximum amount of damage, whereas one gun might in theory allow the enemy to fire back at you before you can reload. And I think it would be very nice to get the next evolution of the KV-7 in-game. In real life, the KV-7 was tested, and some minor issues were found that would need fixing. But by now, interest in the tank waned, and development seems to have stopped, with the tank last seen in December 1943 alongside some other prototypes, and it was scrapped soon afterwards. So in 1941 there wouldn't be much development work carried out on new heavy tanks, but in 1942, as things became a little bit less desperate, steps would be taken to potentially improve or replace the KV-1, with various different projects being carried out. One of these was aimed at potentially improving the firepower, and this was the KV-9, which in December 1941 was fitted with a 122mm U-11 howitzer, which is essentially a tank version of the in-game M30 howitzer, and came about due to a lack of 76.2mm guns, rather than an concerted attempt to improve the firepower. That said, the 122mm howitzer would have made the KV-9 a better tank for infantry support, while in-game the howitzer can fire smoke shells, HE shells with 36.7mm penetration, or the BP-350A heat shell, which has 160mm of penetration, a far better performance than the shells of the CIS-5, with its best performing shell only managing 117mm at point blank range, meaning the KV-9 can take down much tougher tanks than the KV-1 can. Unfortunately, there are some downsides to this increase in armour penetration, as while the HE shell has a muzzle velocity of 515 meters a second, the heat shell only manages 355, making it rather hard to aim this shell at longer ranged targets, and even worse, in firing tests the rate of fire was only 2 shots per minute. So if you did miss your target, you would have a very long wait to try again, and due to the size of the howitzer in the turret, its maximum depression was only 2 degrees. Meanwhile, it seems like the usual 3 machine guns are carried, one at the rear of the turret, one in the bow and one in the coaxial position, which will probably be your only weapon available between reloads. As for the armour, I've seen some sources stating that it maxes out to 135mm for the front, though most seem to suggest a maximum of 90mm for the turret's mantlet, 75mm for the rest of the cast turret, and around 75mm for the hull, still making this decently well protected. Lastly, the speed seems to have been similar to the KV-1 at 21.7 miles per hour or 35 kilometers an hour, and the usual 5-man crew was carried. In game, I could see the KV-9 being added at battle rating 4.0 to 4.3, with this tank playing differently to existing KV-1s, being able to penetrate more armour with the heat shell and excelling at hitting close-in targets, but being let down by its long reload and slow moving shells, meaning you will have to rely on your teammates to protect you while reloading, but I could still see this being an effective tank in War Thunder. In real life, the KV-9 did pass its initial trials in February 1942, but never progressed beyond a prototype, mainly due to the slow rate of fire, but also because the HE shell was unable to penetrate 76mm armour plate, and despite being around for a few years, the prototype would be scrapped in December 1943, though the turret would be mounted on the KV-13 hull for use as a test bed when working on the IS tanks, so it did see some useful service in a sense. Speaking of the KV-13, this was in development at the same time as the T-43 and based on the same requirements for a universal tank, with the protection of the KV-1 and mobility of the T-34, with a weight reduction desperately being needed as the KV-1 started having breakdowns from the excessive weight of the tank. The KV-13 would only use some components from the KV-1, such as the engine and torsion bar suspension system, while a few components were taken from the T-34, and 2 prototypes were due by August 1942, but these seem to have been delayed by Stalin due to a need to focus on existing tanks, while the lighter KV-1S was now approved for production, which helped alleviate some of the reliability concerns. Despite work supposedly being halted, it did carry on at a slow rate. not helped by the death of the chief engineer of the project, who died of a heart attack on the 19th of July 1942. And while there were orders to halt work on the KV-13, a prototype would ultimately be finished in September 1942. The design was successful at reducing the weight, now coming in at 31 tonnes compared to 47 tonnes for the KV-1 model 1941, allowing it to reach a top speed of 34 miles per hour or 55 kilometers an hour, faster than the KV-1S and the original KV-1s, which is a great advantage for those playing Soviet heavy tanks. Despite the reduction in weight, the frontal hull armour maxes out at 120mm, with the hull sides being 75mm and the turret being 80 to 90mm all round. So this is still a very well protected tank, all things considered. Unfortunately, like with the T-43, the focus has been on the armour, and so the armament hasn't been changed, with this still being the 76mm CIS-5 gun, which does limit what tanks the KV-13 can take down, while the crew is now reduced from 5 to 3 or 4, as the bow machine gun position has been eliminated, and initially only 2 crew could fit in the turret, but some sources say that this was increased to 3 by the time of the first tests. In-game, I think the KV-13 could be added at 5.0, as we now have a very mobile and well-protected heavy tank, only held back by its lackluster gun and lower crew count. But I think the advantages gained from the extra mobility and protection will still allow it to do well at this battle rating, and it would be nice to see it added to the Soviet tech tree. In real life, the KV-13 would be put through testing on the 26th of September 1942, but numerous issues came up, from the engine overheating, the gearbox not working at higher speeds, the wheels and tracks becoming damaged, etc, etc. This was far from ideal, but said work on the design wasn't completely wasted, as the turret would be used in a modified form on the KV-1S. Work would quickly begin on a second KV-13 prototype, with this carrying a 76mm F-34 gun, which performs the same as the CIS-5 in-game, as well as having a redesigned hull, slightly more armour, and an increased weight of 37.5 tonnes, a new gearbox, and a slightly reduced top speed. However, like with the T-43, by now it was seen that upgrading the armour was a worse proposition than upgrading the main armament, which would lead to the Soviets developing the KV-85 and later IS-1, which used the whole configuration of the KV-13. So while not a successful design in its own right, the KV-13 did lead the way for far more important Soviet heavy tanks. So with the Germans now fielding tanks with thicker armour and better guns, it was time for the Soviets to upgun its tanks, which would eventually lead to the 85mm armed T-34-85 and IS-1, and later the 122mm armed IS-2 heavy tank, while the KV-85, which was a KV-1S hull with an IS-1 turret, would serve as a stopgap until the IS tanks were entering service. However, there was an alternative design to the KV-85 in the form of the Object 238, which instead of fitting a new turret, simply fitted the 85mm S-31 gun directly into the KV-1S's original turret, similar to the T-34-76 that was converted to take an 85mm gun that we looked at earlier. This did technically work, as in the gun did fit and it could be fired, which did greatly boost the firepower of the KV-1S, but again this left the turret extremely cramped, which resulted in the fire rate being greatly reduced to about half that of the KV-85, while the elevation was reduced from plus 23 degrees on the KV-85 to just 7 degrees for the Object 238. Other than the new 85mm gun, the only other changes were to the mantlet, while the weight increased by 0.6 tonnes, which should affect mobility a little bit, and the crew still numbers 5 like on the KV-1S, so 1 more than the KV-85, giving it an advantage in survivability. I could see the Object 238 being added in-game at 4.7 to 5.0, as we still have all of the advantages of the KV-1S, paired with a much more powerful gun, but the slower firing rate compared to the KV-85 should offset some of these advantages. But I still think this would be an interesting addition to the game. In real life, 2 prototypes of the Object 238 were made, with one put through trials in August 1943, but it ultimately wasn't accepted for service, with the competing Object 239 being accepted instead as the KV-85, and no more prototypes were made. That said, while one prototype was used for other tests, the other one was kept at Kubinka, and actually survives to this day in working condition. So this tank at least had a happy ending. Despite the failure of the Object 238, this wasn't actually the last attempt to fit an 85mm gun into the KV-1S, with another KV-1S being fitted with the 85mm S28 in August 1944, which is essentially the same as the S53 from the T-34-85. However, it does seem a little bit odd to test this out well over a year after the KV-1S had gone out of production, and after the IS-2 had become the standard heavy tank. But clearly it was felt that something was to be gained from this conversion. In testing, it was found that the gun had a slightly improved fire rate over the Object 238, and conditions in the turret were more akin to those in the T-34-85. So it certainly seems better than the Object 238 already, with the only other change being to the mantlet. Like with the Object 238, this could be added in-game, probably as a premium or event tank, having a slightly higher fire rate over the Object 238, giving us a slightly better alternative to that tank. In real life, the overall impressions were far more positive, but by this point the KV-1S had been out of production for well over a year, and as mentioned, the IS-2 was now the standard heavy tank. And of course, the T-34-85 brought the 85mm gun to the battlefield in far greater numbers. So there was little need to recall what few KV-1Ss remained in the field to produce what would still be an inferior tank to those now in production, so this again remained a one-off prototype. So that is the various attempts to upgun the KV-1S, with the first of these losing out to the KV-85, but as it turns out there were also attempts to upgun that tank, as in December 1943 a KV-85 was fitted with a new 100mm S34 gun. Naturally, this gun is a fair bit more powerful than the original 85mm gun, with the 85mm gun's stock APHE shell having a penetration at 500 metres of 126mm, versus 201mm for the APHE BC shell of the 100mm gun, a far better armour penetration, and due to the muzzle velocity of 895 metres a second versus 792 metres a second for the 85mm gun, it should be easier to hit longer ranged targets, while the rate of fire is about 6 rounds per minute. So again, not too different to the 85mm gun of the KV-85. Some modifications were required to fit the gun into the KV-85's turret, with the commander and loader swapping positions in the turret and the mantlet being modified. Other than these areas, the armour thickness should be the same, as well as the crew count, while I suspect mobility would be affected due to the larger gun. In-game, I think this 100mm armed KV-85 could be added at 6.3 to 6.7, as it now has a massive upgrade in firepower, but still has the original armour, with the hull only maxing out at 75mm and the turret at 100mm. So any return fire would easily knock you out, though it should be marginally more manoeuvrable than the IS-1 and IS-2, so that should help a little bit, and it would be nice for this unique KV-85 variant to have some use in Tier 4. In real life, the 100mm gun was tested in January 1944, and while there were a few issues identified, it seemed to be an okay design. Unfortunately, it was only converted for testing purposes and was never actually expected to go into production, so only the one prototype was built. A similar test would be conducted with the 100mm gun on the IS-2 as the Object 248, but this wasn't accepted as despite being better against armour, the 122mm gun carried a far more useful HE shell, though the Object 248 is in-game as an event tank. However, there was a similar test on the Object 244, which interestingly was initially indexed as the IS-3, and this was essentially the Object 237 that had been accepted as the IS-1, but now with an improved 85mm D5T 85BM gun. Now I haven't found exact stats for this gun, but the muzzle velocity has been increased from 792 metres a second to around 900, though with the possibility of going up to 910. So it's got an increase of around 13%, with the penetration expected to increase by the same amount, which would give it a penetration at 500 metres of 142mm compared to 126mm for the IS-1's stock APHE shell. A decent if not spectacular increase in firepower, while the shells are only 0.5kg heavier, meaning the rate of fire of 9.6 seconds stock can be maintained. In-game, I would add the Object 244 at around 6.0, perhaps between the IS-1 and IS-2, as this is for all intents and purposes just a straight upgrade over the IS-1, and due to only the gun changing, it should be relatively easy to implement, and I think this would be a very good addition to the game. In real life, the Object 244 was quickly abandoned, as while it's now performed slightly better, this was not considered enough of an improvement, especially as the 100 and 122mm guns that were tested on the IS-2 were far better performing weapons in the anti-tank and anti-infantry role, so this again remained a one-off prototype. So finally, after all of these tests, the Soviets had settled with the IS-2 and its 122mm gun as its standard heavy tank from 1944 until the end of the war, with the IS-3 being introduced in 1945 as a replacement, though this was just a little too late to see action in World War II. However, there was another design that could have potentially replaced the IS-2, this being the Object 701, which began development in August 1943 and resulted in a prototype in April 1944. The Object 701 was to be more heavily armoured, with its turret maxing out at 170mm and the lower hull being 150mm, while the upper hull was 120, compared to 100 for the IS-2. Meanwhile, the side armour is 160 and the rear hull is 120, which combined with the sloping makes this a decently well protected tank. The gun is also changed, as it is now the 122mm S34-2, which was intended as a replacement to the D25T of the IS-2, with the main differences being the lack of a muzzle brake, the sliding breech block being semi-automatic, the inclusion of a bore fume evacuation system to remove fumes in the turret, and the moving of the gunner from the left to the right side of the tank. Potentially the fire rate will be a bit faster due to these changes, but the performance against armour should be broadly the same, penetrating 182mm of armour at 500 metres with the stock APHE round, while a coaxial 7.62mm DT machine gun was also carried. The Object 701 would end up weighing around 55 tonnes, 9 tonnes more than the IS-2, though the top speed is a little unclear as it seems it was never tested, but it was supposedly capable of 21.7 to 24.8 miles per hour or 35 to 40 kilometers an hour, so very similar to the IS-2, while the total crew count is 4, with the driver in the hull and the gunner, commander and loader in the turret. In-game I could see this working at 7.0 between the IS-2 and IS-3, as it has a similar gun to both these tanks and similar mobility, while having better armour than the IS-2 yet worse than the IS-3, meaning it could fit between these two tanks. Ultimately more prototypes would be made, with these testing various different design elements, with the armour being changed and improved and different armaments being tested, such as a 50mm mortar in the turret roof, as well as many other changes, and these prototypes could also be added in-game, but ultimately by 1945 these prototypes, while intriguing, were not accepted for service. Then problems cropped up with the IS-3, so in 1946 the Object 701 was accepted into service under the designation IS-4, though only 224 would be built as the IS-4, with that tank already in the regular tech tree after the IS-3. Despite the IS-4 not turning out great in the long run, there are still more heavy tanks being designed during and immediately after the war, such as the Object 252 or IS-6, a tank that we already have in game, while the IS-5 would be redesignated and become the IS-10 or T-10 heavy tank. However, the IS-6 or Object 252 had a sister project, the Object 253, with the main difference between these tanks being the use of an electrical transmission, which basically works by the engine powering an electrical generator that in turn powers electrical motors to turn the sprockets. The advantage of this system meant the tank could have the same top speed going forwards and backwards, and could deliver instant torque, making this tank far more mobile on the battlefield compared to the regular IS-6. Unfortunately, this system was on the heavy side, increasing the weight to 54 tonnes, 3.5 tonnes heavier than the Object 252, which would likely reduce its mobility a little bit. Meanwhile, the armament is the 122mm D25-2 as found in the IS-2, instead of the 122mm D30T of the IS-6, which puts the Object 253 at a bit of a disadvantage, as while the shells fired are the same and have the same performances, the D25 has a stock reload rate of 27 seconds versus 20 seconds for the D30T, leaving the Object 253 at a bit of a disadvantage. Meanwhile, the armour should be broadly the same as the IS-6, maxing out at 150mm for the turret and 120mm for the hull, and the crew is 4, with the driver in the hull and the rest in the turret. In-game, the Object 253 could probably be added at 7.7, like with the IS-6, with the Object 253 having an advantage from its electrical transmission, allowing it to better peek around corners or reverse out of dangerous situations, but suffers from a longer reload rate for its main gun, which is a big problem when most of its competitors already have faster firing guns as it is. But it would still be nice for this heavy tank prototype to be represented in game. In real life, the Object 253 was finished by early 1945, along with the Object 252 with its more traditional transmission, and it was to be put through tests. In these tests, it was learnt that despite the weight increase, its mobility was similar to the IS-2. Unfortunately, it seems like this was pretty much the only thing that was learnt, as after just 10 kilometers the tank caught fire, and the IS-6 project was cancelled. That said, the Object 253 would be used as a test bed for the IS-7, and so would be put through testing again in 1947, and managed to travel a total distance of 1,025 kilometers. But once testing was done, the Object 252 and 253 would ultimately be scrapped. So that just about brings us to the end of the Soviet heavy tanks, and boy were there a lot of them, allowing us to move on to the Soviet flamethrower tanks. The first of these are the Ognimyotny tanks, I've probably butchered that pronunciation, or OT-34, which is basically a regular T-34-76 that has had the bow machine gun position replaced initially by an AT-041 flamethrower and later the AT-042, which has a range of 90 to 120 metres and has enough fuel for 6 2-second bursts, though I've also seen sources saying up to 30 bursts were possible, while a fuel tank is carried for the flamethrower and the radio is moved to the rear of the turret. In-game, this would probably work at 3.3 to 4.0 depending on which T-34-76 model is used, with these tanks retaining their existing advantages and pairing them with an effective flamethrower weapon, allowing them to engage soft-skinned vehicles much more effectively, while still retaining their ability to deal with enemy tanks, but also introducing a new vulnerability due to the extra fuel tank being carried internally, which could lead to more fires or internal explosions. But overall, this tank seems like a very effective way of adding Soviet flamethrower tanks to the early tiers. The OT-34 would prove to be successful, and so when the T-34-85 was introduced, a flamethrower variant would naturally follow, giving us the OT-34-85 being fitted with the same AT-042 flamethrower and also having an extra fuel tank installed. In-game, this could be added at 5.7, and overall, like with the OT-34, this is just the T-34-85, but fitted with a flamethrower, which is of course very good as it retains its ability to deal with enemy tanks, and I could see both Soviet OT-34 variants being very popular with players on the Soviet tech tree. In real life, both variants would see success against German forces throughout the war, especially when attacking fortified German positions, and they would remain in service until the end of the war and at least a few years beyond it. However, there was also some heavy tank flamethrower variants, these being the KV-8 and KV-8S, which are based on the KV-1 and KV-1S respectively, and are modified in a way that is a lot more unique than the OT-34s, as instead of just placing the AT-041 flamethrower in the bow, it is mounted in the turret in place of the coaxial machine gun, and is capable of 107 bursts up to 100 metres, depending on the mix of fuel used. However, because it was placed in the turret, there was no longer room for the 76mm gun, which had to be removed. But in order to give the KV-8 some sort of anti-tank capability, it is instead replaced by a 45mm gun, which is placed inside a larger tube to conceal the smaller armament, with this obviously being a downgrade in anti-tank capability, with the 45mm gun's APHE-BC shell being capable of penetrating 60mm of armour at 500 metres, versus 70mm for the KV-1's length 11 gun, or 84mm for the CIS-5, with their equivalent shells. The rest of the stats are the same, having the same armour, crew and mobility, though the inclusion of fuel tanks for the flamethrower does of course make the KV-8 a little bit more vulnerable in the event of a successful penetration. Now, finding a place in game for the KV-8 and KV-8S is a little bit difficult, as putting them at a lower battle rating than the existing KV-1s might cause issues with the thicker armour, while putting it at the same or higher battle ratings will lead to issues where the 45mm gun is virtually useless against most enemies. So I could see this being a low priority for adding, and I could even see some calls from the community for it not to be added. I personally think the best way to add them would be to add the KV-8S at 4.0, while the KV-8 could be added at 3.7 to 4.0, depending on which KV-1 model it's based on. It's probably not the perfect way to add them, and no doubt there will be some flaws to adding them this way, but it's the best idea I can think of as of the time of writing. So that just about brings us to the end of this episode looking at Soviet World War II tanks, and to be honest, I'm always surprised how many new Soviet tanks and variants there are to add, especially for the heavy tanks. So hopefully we might see some of these tanks added in the future, and I will of course cover Soviet tank destroyers, armoured cars and anti-air vehicles in a future episode. I'd also be interested to hear your thoughts on these tanks and any other tanks you'd like me to cover in the comments below. I will probably cover Japanese tanks for the next episode, so hopefully that one will be a little bit shorter, and of course at some point I am going to have to start researching some of these tank destroyers, assault guns, armoured cars and anti-air vehicles for nations that I have already covered, as it has been a while since I looked at the tanks for those nations. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the episode, hopefully you'll join me for the next one. I've been Tyranno and I'll see you next time.